Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Jane Kamensky. I'm the president and CEO of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and it's a thrill to welcome you all to Monte Alto, the high mountain behind Monticello on this side, looking out over Charlottesville on the terrace behind you, and think about this as a place of founding vision, which I think we'll hear a lot about this afternoon. I want to thank Yuval and Nicole and their colleagues at AEI, Megan Howerton and Elsa Winter, and my colleagues here at Monticello for putting together this event this afternoon, which comes right into the sort of first derivative acceleration phase of our 2026 anniversary season here at Monticello. As you may be aware, our guy wrote it. May I ask Ms. Reynolds to show her shirt? We've got the Monticello merch here. And we're doing a huge amount of anniversary programming and development exhibitions, all centered on two things. One, the Declaration of Independence with Thomas Jefferson as the primary author, thinking about the Declaration both as a historical event and as a living legacy. One of our big initiatives around the Declaration is Declaration Book Club, which is a national, international, downloadable, open educational resource that I hope you'll check out. You're a natural constituency for it. So the Declaration is one through line to our investment in this season of what I hope will be a profound civic re-engagement and renewal around the semi-quincentennial. The other is the practice of pluralism, which is a naturally Jeffersonian history, legacy, and value, and I think one where we are natural partners with the American Enterprise Institute. We have a new tour called Founding Friends, Founding Foes, which models the fact that civil disagreement is a feature and not a bug of constitutional democracy, centered on the relationship between Jefferson and Adams. If you haven't had a chance to take that tour, please come back or stay and do so. We're with the tour and beyond it, promoting a Feast of Reason program, which is a structured conversation, again, in the model of Jefferson's dinner table, to talk to friends and talk to strangers about things trivial and personal and important and profound. We're engaging in key partnerships for the anniversary year and beyond, with groups ranging from the umbrella of Presidential Sites, More Perfect, to the New Pluralists Funders Collective, to the National Civic Collaboratory, to the Jack Miller Center, and of course, AEI. I came here in 2024 to underline Monticello's importance as a civic renewal and civil society organization, as well as a museum and historic house, and 2026 is a great year to be rolling out that vision. You may have read that we had a recent investment from the Carnegie Corporation in our civic work to the tune of $1 million over the next 2 years to lead giving that will help us establish programs like these and more. I'm truly honored to be a part of this gathering, both as a co-host and as a historian whom Yuval Levin recruited to this volume. We're welcoming you here partly with my honorarium turned back to the project, so we could engage you here in Charlottesville to engage in this work of celebration, reflection, recommitment, and renovation, which I think is the core of this 8-volume series that AEI is putting out into the world. With the profound wisdom of Lincoln scholar Alan Gelzo among us, I thought I would quote Lincoln: "This is a time to rededicate ourselves to what he called in the Gettysburg Address the unfinished work of American constitutional democracy." An anniversary is a great excuse to trumpet that dedication. So with that, I want to turn the podium over to Yuval and AEI, and thank you for being such vocal champions of this important work.
Thank you so much, Jen. I really appreciate that, and we're tremendously grateful for your partnership in this and for your hosting us at this really extraordinary place. And grateful to Jay not only as a host, but as a scholar for participating in this project and taking part in what we're up to. This gathering is, for us at AEI, part of a larger, ambitious project to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the founding. And I wanted to offer, by way of a word of welcome and gratitude, also a bit of a word about what it is that this project involves and how this gathering fits into it. 2026, of course, will mark the 250th anniversary of the American founding, of the Declaration of Independence in particular, next July. And a lot of different organizations, as you're beginning to hear, will recognize that milestone in a variety of ways. But in thinking through what distinct kind of contribution we might be able to make at the American Enterprise Institute, we decided that we should produce something of a lasting intellectual product through a set of conferences that then will yield a set of books and further educational materials that explore how Americans now should understand some of the key themes and questions that are at issue in our country's founding. These are materials that will outlast the anniversary, that can serve educators and students and citizens for many years to come. And to do that, they're going to draw on scholars from a variety of fields with a diversity of viewpoints to offer Americans some wisdom about our civic and political inheritance. So over the course of more than 2 years now, we've hosted 8 scholarly conferences, each of which has been devoted to a particular facet of the character and legacy of the American Revolution. The first of them considered democracy and the Revolution. The second looked at some economic facets of the American founding. The third looked at religion and the founding. The fourth thought about natural rights and the common good in the American Revolution. The fifth looked at slavery and equality and the Revolution. The sixth was on the Revolution and America's role in the world. We had that one at George Washington's Mount Vernon. The seventh was on the Revolution and the Constitution. And this is the 8th and final of these conferences, in which we'll talk about the legacy of the American founding as it has been understood at different points in our history. The history of our history, you might say, in a way that can help us think about this moment too. Each of these conferences will result in a book of essays on its theme, as well as in various video and audio and digital media products. The first 3 of the books are out from our first 3 conferences. There are copies outside, which please do take them. You're welcome to them. The 8 books will be gathered into a collection that will be published in time for the July 4th, 2026 anniversary, and will be widely distributed as an educational and civic resource. We're going to make them available to public libraries, to college and high school teachers, to interested citizens in general. The essays will also be online, all of them for free. Our goal is really to create a 21st century literature on the founding and to help inform and reinforce the growing movement to strengthen civic education in this moment in America. As I say, most of our conferences have been at AEI in Washington. One of them has been at Mount Vernon, and we're just tremendously grateful and thrilled to have this one here at Jefferson's Monticello. Your guy did write it, as you say, and this is really the place to have this capstone celebration that, in a way, is the final of our conferences, but is also the beginning of our process and project of celebrating 2026. In today's gathering, as in every one of these 8 conferences, we're taking up a subject that demands careful thought and that will benefit from the attention of a variety of scholars who come at it from different angles, different disciplinary angles, different sorts of ways of thinking about our history. And today's subject is also, like all of those others, really exceptionally timely. How we understand the American founding shapes and frames how we understand ourselves. This has been true at every moment in American history. And as Americans have tried to understand the time they're living in, they've always tried to see it through the lens of the American founding. We do that now, and we would benefit enormously from thinking about how Americans have done that in the past and how our thinking about our country's beginning has shaped our country's evolution and will shape our country's future. We're going to learn about that complicated and important subject with the help of a number of really great scholars this afternoon, an extraordinary all-star lineup. We're going to do it in 2 panels. We will begin with one hosted by my colleague at AEI and co-editor of this project, Adam White. Adam is the Lawrence Silberman Chair in Constitutional Governance at AEI. He's a great scholar of the law and the Constitution. He will begin with a conversation with Wilfred McClay. Our hope and aim had been to also have our good friend Rita Koganzin from UNC here, and she's here. Okay, well, I was about to say she's not here. All right, great. Well, that's wonderful timing. So he will talk with Wilfred McClay and with Rita Koganzin. He'll introduce them both to you. We'll take a short break after that, and then our second panel will be moderated by Christine Rosen, our colleague at AEI, a senior fellow at AEI, and a great historian herself. And she'll moderate a conversation between Rick Brookhiser, Jane Kamensky, and Alan Gelzo. We're tremendously grateful to all of them for being here, to all of you for being here. And with no further ado, let me turn things over to Adam and our first panel.
Yeah, and Rita is here. Yeah, great. Please join me. I just want to add to Yuval's sentiments as we settle in for this first panel of the last conference in this series. It's been such a joy to help Nicole and Yuval and the team put together this series. We hold these truths over the course of the last couple of years, and a real honor as well, an honor to be joined by these scholars, by these institutions, and what better way to finish this series than with today's scholars. I'm very, very grateful to be joined on stage today by Wilfred McClay and Rita Koganzin. I'll just introduce them both briefly. Wilfred McClay is a professor of history at Hillsdale College. More specifically, he's the Victor Davis Hanson Chair in Classical History and Western Civilization. I was teasing before, I thought I had a pretty imposing title, the Lawrence Silberman Chair, but it's hard to top the Victor Davis Hanson Chair. In 2019, he published his landmark book, his account of American history, Land of Hope, an invitation to the great American story. His other books include 2007's Figures in the Carpet, Finding the Human Person in the American Past. And seated next to Professor McClay is Rita Koganzin. Rita is an associate professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's School of Civic Life and Leadership. She teaches political theory and American politics. Her first book was Liberal States, Authoritarian Families, Childhood and Education in Early Modern Thought. And her next book will focus on American education from the early republic to the 20th century. In a moment, we'll hear from Rita on teaching the revolution, the changing paradigm of American textbooks. But first, we'll hear from Professor McClay on the revolution in American education. Please join me in welcoming Professor McClay.
Thank you. Well, hello. This is a wonderful occasion, a wonderful place, and I'm happy that some friends are here to enjoy it and join me in being in this wonderful place. I'm honored to be part of this very reflective celebration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, which is underway. That is the celebration. The revolution happened, but we did have Lexington and Concord back in April, and so it's underway. And the Declaration of Independence, which we'll celebrate next July. And to observe this moment in this special place, the home of the Declaration's principal author, he didn't write all of it, but the place that was his anchor for all of his adult life, what he will always come back to, even when it was constantly under construction and renovation and improvement with the ever-tinkering Jefferson in charge. How appropriate that seems, that rare combination of dynamism and rootedness inherent in the place itself as well as in its most illustrious resident. And how important also to speak of education at the home of American education's perhaps most forceful, early, and enduring advocate. There are plenty of different ways to address the assignment that we've been given by the conference organizers. I've chosen to treat the revolution in American education as a question of how we're to incorporate knowledge about the American Revolution into the education of Americans. In particular, as Yuval has alluded to, the civic education of young Americans. Whether that process itself might be revolutionary, might involve our entertaining a new and different way of thinking about what we ought to be doing in the field of education. That's part of the question. There's something about this place, being here, that makes one feel comfortable with revolutionizing ideas. But I'll confine myself at the outset to some more basic things, and then we can see where that leads. My beginning assumption, and I think many, if not most Americans would agree, is that in some way the Revolution and the Declaration have always been fundamental to our understanding of what America is or what America aspires to be. That can present a problem, of course, if there's not universal consensus as to what the Revolution was and what it meant, both in its own time and in ours. And if you ask the historians, they will agree on one thing: there is no consensus. Historians have been having a field day with this matter for at least the past century or so, and although it's a rather sweeping generalization for me to make, I think it's fair to say the historians are at best ambivalent in their views of the Revolution. Ambivalent doesn't mean indifferent. It means that they're not settled in any one pattern. It would require a bibliographical essay that you don't want to listen to of considerable length to tabulate and chart all the different perspectives that have been on offer. I think a lot of it, much of it, boils down to the famous dichotomy expressed by the historian Carl Becker in 1909 between the Revolution understood as a dispute over home rule and the Revolution as a dispute over who would rule at home. Nice little phrase. Or more generally, between the Revolution as a primarily elite political affair in which the role of ideas and ideals played a central part, or the Revolution as a burgeoning social revolution, at times bordering on civil war, which would lead in the direction, vaguely realizing, as Robert Frost would say, but vaguely realizing in the direction of a more democratic and egalitarian society. In fact, the historian Michael Haddam, in an interesting new book called The Memory of '76, argues that our reliance on the Revolution as a steady source of national identity and self-definition, he calls it our origin myth, has caused us more trouble than it's been worth. As he puts it, while, and I quote, "the popular memory of the Revolution has been an important vehicle through which Americans have defined and voiced their understanding of the present and their hopes for the future, our origin myth has been consistently contested and has informed conflicts over," and again I quote, "partisanship, regionalism, race, gender, class, ethnicity, and religion." He concludes that, quote, "remembering the nation's founding has often done far more to divide Americans than it has to unite them, and that revising the past is an important and long-standing American political tradition." Well, this is neither the time or place for a book review, and I'm not going to do one. But at the risk of failing to do full justice to Mr. Haddam's book, I would point out two things. First, he doesn't propose an adequate alternative to our current contested origin myth. If one's going to introduce an anthropological reasoning about these things, one ought to be consistent about it and not only use anthropology exclusively as a tool of debunking. If societies need origin myths, then they need them, and the need can't be ignored. Second, and more seriously, it's just possible that a pattern of contestation is not a bug, but rather a feature of a free society. It's possible to revere Thomas Jefferson, as I do, and yet celebrate a society in which Jefferson can be openly derided and even despised as a hypocrite, spendthrift, dilettante, domestic tyrant, racist, and what have you, as many do. Perhaps having a contested origin myth is not such a bad thing if you're interested in having a free society. And there is the fact that a pattern of contestation is unarguably present in all great modern revolutions that have had a lasting impact. We found out in 1989, the 200th anniversary of the French Revolution that commenced in 1789, just how ambivalent the French are about the meaning of their own revolution, the iconic modern revolution, modern European revolution. Yes, the French nearly all embrace republicanism, which they love so much that just one republic has not been enough for them. They've had 5 of them, and counting, Mr. Macron. Yet another reason why Zhou Enlai's famous, if largely apocryphal, statement in response to a question about the impact of the French Revolution, you may remember he supposedly said, "It's too early to say." Why that's lasted so long, even though it appears that he did say it, but he was talking about the French Revolution of 1968 rather than 1789. Even so, the statement, these apocryphal things endure because they have a certain resonance. It certainly makes Zhou look wiser than he apparently was. But I don't think it would be justifiable to say the same thing about the American Revolution, that it's too soon to tell. There's something unique about the role played by the American Revolution in American culture as an agent of stability, an energizing reference point. The spirit of '76, as Lincoln and others so often use the term. This paradoxical uniqueness is made evident by the fact that one of the most conservative organizations in the United States is called the Daughters of the American Revolution. Not as conservative as it used to be, or at least not as exclusive, but still, I think the point is made. The essential character of the American Revolution has been looked upon by Americans as something that is to be conserved, protected, revered, sustained, maybe finished, as Jane's quotation of Lincoln suggests. This propensity is not entirely unique to us. In Mexico, for most of the 20th century, the dominant political party was known as the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution, or the PRI, Partido Revolucionario. Why am I trying to do Spanish? I can't. Take my word for it. It's PRI. Partido Revolucionario Institucional. Well, close enough. Yet for most of its history, this party, the PRI, was as ossified and unrevolutionary as the meticulously preserved corpse of Vladimir Lenin, which is still on display today in Moscow's Red Square, just as it has been for over a century now. This is perhaps what an institutionalized revolution is destined to look like. So the problem is this: how do you keep the energy of revolution bottled up and yet vital? How to avoid the descent from aspirational charisma into corpse-cold routinization, the fate that Max Weber saw as the eventual fate of all energetic and inspired political activity. William Wordsworth wrote famously about the French Revolution as it appeared to its enthusiastic contemporaries. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. Oh, times in which the meager, stale, forbidding ways of custom, law, and statute took at once the attraction of a country in romance. But of course, that ecstatic, romantic dawn didn't last for long. Not for France and not for Wordsworth. Lincoln worried over a similar problem in his youthful Lyceum address, in which he lamented how the success of the American Revolution was being overtaken and negated by the growth of lawlessness and violence. The revolution didn't need to be fought over again, he thought. Instead, it needed to be preserved. He traced out the need for a form of civic education, what he called a political religion, which centered around an education entailing reverence for the laws and devotion to reason as keys to the steady perpetuation of our institutions. I think we can take Lincoln's thoughts as a starting point in answering the problem for ourselves. If the spirit of '76, the spirit of the Declaration, is to be preserved and perpetuated, and perhaps we should say revived, education will have to play a central role, a civic education, an education for Republican citizenship. And here, permit me to interject a personal note related to my somewhat quixotic decision to write a textbook in American history designed for high school students. I won't go into the reasons for my decision, but Don Quixote didn't explain himself either. But I will tell you a story about it. And it was at an AEI event. I met a man, I won't mention his name, a very high-powered New York City lawyer, white shoe law firm, who came to a talk that I gave about the book as it was aborning. And we had dinner together afterwards. And he said to me over the dinner, he says, I am convinced that if children are taught to believe that the regime under which they live is not a good one, it will do damage to their souls. And this affected me very deeply, him saying this. It's something that I can't say that I'd ever quite framed that way, put into words. And I think he's right. I was convinced at the time, and I remain convinced that he's right, that that aspect of education, of the moral formation of the young, is something we need to think about. I thought, too, of all the times that I have asked scholars who were writing extremely negative things about the founders. I say that word tentatively. Jack Green, who was one of my teachers, says, "Don't ever use the F word around me." So, the founders. But I would ask, how do you feel about this your work, say, proving that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, just to give one example. How do you think it affects young people and the way that they view their country? And the answer I always would get is the same. It's not my job. That's not my job to think about those things. It's not my job to think about the effects of the research I do. It's my job to be as honest and thorough, obeying the canons of the profession as I can be. Well, that leaves the question, whose job is it? Who has that job? Does anybody have that job? To think about the history as a morally formative aspect of life in a republic, of citizens who need to make up that republic. So this guy's remarks really made quite an impression on me. We Americans need to know our history. We need to know it better than we have in the past. Why? Because we're not a people bound together by origins in blood and soil. We're people with origins in many bloods and soils. And we celebrate this pluralism. We're linked by shared aspirations and principles embodied in shared institutions, embedded in a shared history with its shared triumphs and shared sufferings. These things must be taught and learned by each successive generation, but there's a growing danger we're failing to pass along that knowledge to them with untold consequences. Citizenship is a word that's lost a lot of its noble luster. It once had, just as civics has been demoted to little more than a kind of user's guide to the machinery of government. Both words deserve far better. Citizenship is not merely about voting, it's about membership in a society of civic equals. Citizens, not subjects, to hearken back to the language of the revolution. Citizens whose respect for one another's equal standing under the law is a guiding moral premise of the democratic way of life. Civic education is not only about how a bill becomes a law, it's about promoting a vivid and enduring sense of our belonging to one of the great enterprises in human history, the story of our own country. Both things involve fostering a sense of felt connection to the past, and gratitude for the things we've inherited, along with a feeling of responsibility for the task of preserving them. So a civic education should be an initiation not only into a canon of ideas and propositions, but into a community, and not just a community of the present, but a community of memory, a long human chain linking past, present, and future in shared recognition. Ultimately, in fact, such an education should be an education in love. Make no mistake, the love we're talking about is something different from romantic or familial love or tribal love, something that cannot be imposed by teachers or schools or government edicts, least of all in a free country. Like any love worthy of the name, it must be embraced freely and be strong and unsentimental enough to coexist with the elements of disappointment, criticism, dissent, opposition, and even shame that come with moral maturity and open eyes. But it's love all the same, and without the deep foundation it supplies, a republic will perish. Now, I've said the fear that Americans might be losing their national soul by forgetting who we are and where we came from is not new. Lincoln had these fears, an unusually prescient young man. The fears of such possibility are not unique to him. They've been a perennial problem, arising anew in each generation of our republic. In our own time, the problem takes the form of a strange paradox. While we know more and more about the American past due to the labors of many battalions of specialized professional historians with advanced degrees and brilliant people with impressive achievements, we actually know less as a people because we lack a shared grasp of the overarching meaning of our history, the kind of meaning that helps to give shape to the way we live together. We lack an adequate perspective on our history, a perspective that allows us to see the great achievements of American history in their proper light, properly weighed against the admitted failings and shortcomings of that history. Our young people especially deserving of a better awareness of the exceptional character of our great experiment in self-rule. Do they realize that there had never before in human history been a nation which explicitly committed itself to the idea that all human beings are equal in the eyes of God, and the only legitimate form of government was one in which the government is answerable to the people it governed? No, they don't. They don't know that, by and large. But they deserve to know. That's part of their legacy as Americans. Instead, though, they're being provided with an entirely different account of things. Instead of learning about the uniqueness of the American story, learning how they can become part of that story, they hear a story filled all too often with shame and failure, a parade of horribles from which they understandably want to distance themselves. And this has its effects. We can't doubt that it has. Education is about the shaping of souls. And an education that teaches the young to be ashamed of their origins and their past cannot help but be damaging to their souls. Small wonder that so many young people struggle to launch in their lives and do not look forward to a future full of promise. We have to change that. We're so solicitous of the safety of college students who might be exposed to ideas and words that are upsetting to them. But we don't think much about the effects of the inglorious story that they're taking in. Doesn't their picture of the world profoundly affect their sense of life's possibilities and prospects? Shouldn't we consider whether the remarkably high indicators of unhappiness among our young people are traceable in part, not exclusively, but in part to a massive loss of morale and hope? Suicides among Americans aged 10 to 24 have increased by more than 60% since 2011. It's the second leading cause of death among people in that age group. And I can give you a long list of other pathologies, but I don't want to go on for too long here. It's hard not to think that these things represent a kind of general moral collapse, or the harbinger of it. So what to do? Well, I'm going to conclude with, and I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. It's going to leave time for Rita. With an example of one of the things that I think we need to do is to not so much concentrate on the propositions of the American founding, but stories in which those propositions are embedded. Stories stay with the young in a way that the propositional statements do not, or they stay on as rote memorized things. So, and I go back to Lincoln. Where else? Jefferson's greatest admirer, arguably. We all know that Lincoln was a voracious reader. He had essentially no formal education and acquired his sense of the English language primarily from reading the King James Bible and Shakespeare's plays. And it appears they didn't read much history, which is a blow to the ego of historians. But James McPherson of Princeton did discover that one book that was very influential to him was Mason Weems's 1799 biography of George Washington, a book that almost no one would read today for its accuracy, certainly. This is the book from which the fable of Washington chopping down the cherry tree and being unable to lie and so on came from. Well, the mature Lincoln went on to develop a more informed sense of understanding of history, and yet traces of Weems's history stayed with him all his life. It was those stories were an enduring deposit in his mind and heart that influenced his view of the American Revolution and the Civil War and his fundamental values. How do we know this? We know it because he said so himself. February of 1861, 40 years after he'd read Weems's book, Lincoln drew on it explicitly. He was on his way from Illinois to Washington to be inaugurated as president. It was a time of extraordinary tension. The southern states were dropping like flies from the Union in response to Lincoln's election. There was a real reason to believe the nation was in the process of disintegrating. Lincoln stopped off in Trenton on his way to Washington, and I'm going to pass over the excuse to make Trenton jokes, but you can just fill them in for yourself. He stopped off in Trenton on his way to Washington and gave a short but powerful speech to the New Jersey State Senate, in which he recalled the effect of Weems's book on him as a young man. He remembered Weems's account of the Battle of Trenton. Lincoln was a politician, and he knew his audience, but it was one of the pivotal moments of the American Revolution. He said this: "I remember all the accounts of the battlefield and struggles for the liberty of the country, and none fixed themselves upon my imagination so deeply as the struggle here in Trenton. The crossing of the river, the contest with the Hessians, the great hardships endured at the time, all of them fixed themselves on my memory more than any single revolutionary event. I remember thinking then, boy, even though I was, there must have been something more than common that those men struggled for. That something more than common was even more, I'm still quoting him, even more than national independence, something that held out a great promise to all the people of the world for all time to come. The perpetuation of the Union, the Constitution, the liberties of the people, and according to the original idea, spirit of 76, I impose, for which that struggle was made." So what a lot for a useful story to do in this time of crisis, to provide a resource for him to draw upon that was both inspiring and true, unlike the cherry tree, and would sustain him in the dark days to come. So what do we conclude from this example? Do historians need to retool and start writing inspiring fables like those of Mason Weems, instead of hard-headed, dispassionate, factual accounts of the past based on careful, methodical research? No, absolutely not. History has to be based on truth and not myths. We do ourselves and the young no favors by prettifying or oversimplifying the past, but we do no favors to ourselves or the truth if we fail to honor the magnificent achievements of our history and leave them out of our account, or as too often has become the case. We need to remember one of the civic functions of history, one of the chief reasons we try to record the past and teach it to our young, is to serve as a vessel of shared memory, imparting to each generation a sense of membership in its own society, a sense of living connection to its own past. Lincoln brought that very connection to many of his best speeches, and most notably, Jane's already mentioned it, his speech, the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg in November of 1863. Just as he had done at Trenton, so he did at Gettysburg, even as the war raged around him, reaching back 77 years to the nation's birth in 1776. As one of the great achievements of human history, a precious legacy to whose preservation the deeds of the present ought to be dedicated. And so can it be for us. Our young people deserve nothing less. We're failing them and our country so long as we fail to give them a rich and sustaining sense of their own past, a sense that's both truthful, flaws very much included, and inspiring. And it's high time that we start to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, thank you, Bill. And as Rita takes the podium, I'll just point out that before she was at the University of North Carolina, she was here at the University of Virginia in the Department of Government and working with James Caesar, our friend, in the program on constitutional government. So Rita, welcome back to Charlottesville, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. Although I was here for 6 years and I never saw this view. I didn't even know this building existed. So this is very nice.
Yeah.
So I think you actually put us in the wrong order, because what I'm going to talk about ends in a kind of aporia about what should be done, and what Bill talked about was what should be done. So you just are going to have to imagine our talks reversed. So just imagine me first raising the problem and Bill answering the problem. So my task for this volume was to examine how the American Revolution has been taught in schools and how that instruction has changed over the last 250 years. Given how unusually decentralized American schooling is, and always has been, this is no small task. The US has about 100,000 public elementary and secondary schools in over 13,000 districts. Add to that 30,000 private schools and some uncertain number of alternative configurations like homeschools and virtual schools and so on, educating another 2 million students. And the hope of learning with any certainty what American schools teach or taught or what students learn rapidly dims. Indeed, an essential part of what schools teach students about our regime is encoded in this decentralized structure itself, the values of federalism, of free association, and most importantly, of self-government. Salutary as these structures are, however, they do not make the task of surveying the changing place of the founding in American education any easier. So one imperfect way around this obstacle is to examine the changing character of American school books. From the Columbian Orator that inspired Frederick Douglass's efforts to realize the promise of the Declaration, to William McGuffey's Eclectic Readers that shaped millions of children in antebellum America, to Harold Rugg's progressive and ultimately divisive Man and His Changing Society, to the recent 1619 Project, American history textbooks give us a fascinating, if somewhat clouded, window into how school instruction about the Revolution and the founding have changed over time. So without downplaying the significant shortcomings of using textbooks as metonyms for American education, they do nonetheless illuminate something of how Americans' sense of their nation has changed. While the textbook market is fractured, there have always been some titles that have predominated and achieved widespread national use and approbation, or equally significantly, national controversy. My essay that I contributed to this volume focuses on a small selection of just such books which have transcended regional and sectional boundaries and encroached on the national consciousness. So what we find when we do examine such books is a distinctive pattern of change in their depiction of the Revolution and the founding. American school books, I would say, have moved through three broad paradigms. First, a 19th century personalist rhetorical model that pursued civic formation through biography and elocution. Then a progressive social scientific model that reframed the Revolution as an economic problem to be managed. And a contemporary sort of structural critical model that personalizes mainly to indict and to motivate political protest, which it views as a civic ideal. So tracing these shifts for the cultural legacy of the American Revolution, what students encounter as the meaning of 1776 is either exemplars to emulate, systems to manage, or structures to resist. And each stance disposes citizens differently, I think, towards the founders, towards political agency, and towards the project of self-government. Through the end of the 19th century, before the development of comprehensive systems of public schooling, American school books like Bingham's Columbian Orator and McGuffey's Eclectic Readers conscripted history and biography into the service of personal moral formation for their readers. Historical figures, including particularly George Washington, were described not only in terms of their roles in political events, but as exemplary individuals in the round, whose virtues were demonstrated by their public and private speeches. These speeches were to be objects of imitation for pupils who would learn to read and speak by emulating the great speeches of the past, and in the process would imbibe the virtues that these speeches extolled. But by the turn of the century, American textbooks took on a more detached and scientific character, focusing on understanding the country and its founding in the context of impersonal political and economic systems, class conflict, industrialization, democratization, 20th century textbooks deployed history not as a guide to character formation, but as one of several social sciences whose mastery would help us develop skills of social and economic problem solving. This shift also entailed a reversal in the book's approach towards the revolution, which went from a triumph to at best a salutary but fumbling step towards the gradual progress that would only reach its full potential centuries later. By the 21st century, these trends had come almost full circle, with texts like the 1619 Project that rejected the founders and raised protest and resistance against government rather than personal virtue or social reform to the highest form of citizenship. So although it's probably not the best-selling reader of the early Republic, Caleb Bingham's Columbian Orator was a formidable contender, selling about 200,000 copies and going through more than a dozen editions between its print run in 1797 to 1820. The text is a compilation of speeches and dialogues collected to, quote, cultivate the art of oratory. And it made a lifelong impression on Ralph Waldo Emerson, on Harriet Beecher Stowe, Horace Greeley, and most famously Frederick Douglass. Douglass described his encounter with it while still enslaved in Baltimore and credited its anti-slavery selections with, quote, giving tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind and died away for want of utterance. What I got was a powerful vindication of human rights. The Columbian Orator, along with its companion volume for younger students, which was called the American Preceptor, taught by the example of its selections rather than direct instruction from Bingham. In the earliest editions, it contained about a dozen American selections, speeches from Rome, France, Britain, and some speeches that Bingham concocted himself. The dialogues and exhortations composed by Bingham typically encouraged filial obedience, piety, industry, and other standard Christian and Republican virtues. And politically, Bingham's selection promoted expanded schooling and religious toleration, and he opposed slavery. He took for granted the righteousness of the American Revolution and the cause of liberty, and he included in his book numerous pro-American English selections, like William Pitt's and Charles James Fox's 1760s and 1770s parliamentary addresses against British colonial policy. But Bingham's American guiding lights remained Washington and Franklin, excerpts from whom dot every edition of the Orator and the Preceptor. By the 1830s, Bingham's books had gone largely out of print, and a newcomer that would leave an indelible mark on American education for almost the next century appeared on the horizon, and that's William McGuffey's Eclectic Readers. However skeptical we might be about the formative significance of textbooks, I think it would be difficult to understate the foundational influence of these unassuming editions on American education. They were the source of still ubiquitous American nursery rhymes and children's songs like Mary Had a Little Lamb and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And by 1850, one historian observes when the entire American population stood at 16 million people, 7 million readers had been sold. By 1890, 100 million readers, or 100 million more, had been published. So McGuffey lionized the American founding. George Washington, the Marquis de Lafayette, and Columbus appear interspersed in the early readers as characters, exemplifying the same virtues that suffuse McGuffey's other stories and excerpts. Washington is portrayed as a child, actually, himself, learning lessons in piety and honesty from his father. McGuffey also collects the Weems story about the cherry tree. And then starting with the fourth reader, which is intended for older students, in the tradition of the Columbian Orator, McGuffey starts relying more on excerpts of speeches, essays, and poems than on his original writings, and his selections include much more overtly political texts. So they include excerpts of Thomas Paine, Daniel Webster's speeches, Jefferson's reconstruction of Chief Logan's speech, speeches by Pitt and Walpole in Parliament, Patrick Henry's Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death speech, and also writings by Benjamin Franklin. If one were to attempt to classify these early textbooks politically, it might be fair to understand them as a formation in civic Republican ideals. But the key is that these textbooks understand their purpose primarily as character formation. While they include sketches of chronology and significant historical events, they more commonly focus on sketching characters, including the Founding Fathers, as heroes for pupils' straightforward emulation. Bingham's and McGuffey's readers should not just learn about George Washington, but they should strive to become him. For older students, elocution is the key to living up to these heroic models. The Columbian Orator is forthrightly designed for that purpose, but the Eclectic Readers, despite their contemporary connotation of the term reader, were also designed to be read aloud. Each one came with a set of suggestions for teachers for its use, which were pedagogical tips for improving recitation, and they made no functional distinction between learning to read and learning to speak properly. Reading and elocution were not merely meant to be mechanical practice, however. So McGuffey writes in the preface, This book is designed for other purposes than merely to teach the pupil to read. The selections have been made with a constant reference to the improvement of the mind as well as to the cultivation of the voice. Many of the lessons require thought in order to be appreciated and before they can be comprehended. Some of these require an extensive range of reading and deep reflection and enable the reader fully to understand the allusions, to enter into the spirit, and to realize the excellence of the extracts. So it was through reading that students would come to a kind of rational account of virtue, but it was through speech that they were meant to reveal it in their own characters. And the two are yoked and developed in tandem by the extracts and the stories of these kinds of early American textbooks. By the 1930s, the founders were subject to the social and economic analysis in school that progressive historians had extolled for decades already. So Harold Rugg's Man and His Changing Society, did any of you ever use this textbook, by the way? If you did, you should see me after this talk. I would like to talk to you. So this was the best-selling textbook series of the 1930s, Man and His Changing Society. And it was a kind of consummate expression of progressive and early New Deal liberal thought. It cheered on reforms that diminished the influence of plutocrats and corporations and expanded the purview of central government as democratic victories for the common people. Rugg's textbooks were being used in over 5,000 school districts at their peak in the 1930s, and they were the most popular social studies textbooks in the country during this period. Man and His Changing Society was, as Rugg put it, a unified course in the social studies, synthesizing history, geography, and civics for the purpose of training citizens of the world by introducing the economic, political, and social problems of American culture. History was a series of problems of living, amenable to technical solutions, which could be discerned when all the facts were made clear. The term problem appears constantly. It's 400 times across the series. And the 5th volume is devoted entirely to an exposition of American problems. That's what it's called. So instead of individual characters, Rugg presents readers with elaborate and impersonal structures and systems. We learn about how power is generated, like electrical power, not political power, how trade is conducted, and distances are traversed. When we finally reach the study of American political history, it's framed as a march towards democracy, a, quote, 3-century struggle to bring about government of the people, by the people, for the people. And while it's optimistic in some ways, this progressive approach naturally renders America's beginnings as a series of undemocratic errors to be fled, rather than achievements meriting celebration. So our founding held some promising seeds for the future, but our greatest national achievements, universal suffrage, a strong central government involved in improving the material life and health of all people through central planning, those are necessarily very recent developments. So in Man and His Changing Society, the revolution takes on precisely this double character as an act of selfish business leaders, as Rugg calls them, looking out above all for their class interests, but who also, often opportunistically, expressed higher principles that would ultimately result in the overthrow of their own aristocratic privileges. Individuals do appear in Rugg's economic-centric narrative of the revolution, but they're not characters so much as historical handymen who drop in from nowhere to perform some essential political task. So James Otis, for example, is a, quote, young colonial lawyer who gave a rousing defense of the Boston merchants. Samuel Adams is a, quote, busy man, that's how he's described, who orchestrated the committees of correspondence. These tasks accomplished, each departs the stage never to be heard from again. The only exception to this value-free submersion of individual character and agency is George Washington. While Washington isn't quite above the class struggle that animates all of Rugg's history, he is the only founder about whom Rugg offers an explicitly positive assessment. He says, were his wealth and experience the only reasons for the confidence people gave him? No, indeed. He had other qualities for which even his enemies honored him, the qualities of a great and generous character. However, Rugg does not elaborate what such qualities might be. Even a great and generous character is just a fact, not intended for imitation or emulation by the reader. Rugg's more characteristic form of praise, however, is far more grudging. While commendable in some ways, for example, the Constitution was ultimately incompatible with the changing needs of the people. He writes, the American Constitution was planned to provide for a stable, conservative, slowly changing government. Practically every provision prevented rapid change. But even before 1900, a totally new civilization had been produced. In this new civilization, change is the most important characteristic. Did the Constitution of the United States and the business of government change to keep pace with the new manner of living? Rugg invites his readers to ask. But the answer, of course, is a foregone conclusion. So despite its enormous popularity in the 1930s, by the early 1940s, Rugg's opposition to free enterprise encountered opposition itself, and the series fell out of favor by the mid-1940s. But Rugg's underlying progressive vision lived on in the unfinished nation paradigm. That's actually the title of one of the major American history textbooks on the market, The Unfinished Nation, that would come to dominate 20th century textbooks long after his own had been dethroned. On this view, the US was founded in the pursuit of noble principles, but could only gradually realize these principles through group conflict and struggle over time. And even today, it falls far short of its visionary aims. The unfinished nation paradigm has the advantage of allowing textbook writers to account for recent or current injustices with optimism. Things may not be perfect yet, but they are ever on a trajectory towards improvement. The cost of this framework, however, is that it always entails a faintly patronizing attitude towards a benighted past, limiting even writers who might wish to depict the revolution and its leaders as exemplary. In a narrative in which the arc of history bends towards justice, it's the arc itself that becomes the main character in history, rather than any individuals who shaped the events. And although McGuffey's readers have maintained something of a cult following among homeschoolers, it's difficult to imagine a wholesale return to that approach to American history in schools today. Most basically, their de-emphasis on chronology and narrative history in favor of biographical sketch and rhetorical extract is incongruent with what modern history instruction fundamentally is. Nonetheless, I think there's perhaps another way in which the moralistic and personalized approach of 19th century education has resurfaced in the present. So history texts like the 1619 Project, the most recent combatant in our ever-recurring history wars, focus a good deal on individuals and grant them substantial agency, delving pretty extensively into the life and motives of, for example, Thomas Jefferson. But unlike McGuffey, who sought out exemplary individuals for imitation, the 1619 Project inverts the same, dilating on Jefferson only to demonstrate that he was a hypocrite and a villain rather than a hero. And Nicole Hannah-Jones, the author of the 1619 Project, is entirely frank about her intention to achieve precisely this inversion in the culture at large. The origin story of the United States, she writes, portrays an intrepid, freedom-loving people. This mythology has positioned almost exclusively white Americans as the architects and champions of democracy. But as this book has shown, a truer origin story requires us to place Black Americans prominently in the role of democracy's defenders and protectors. So the necessity of downgrading the founders is clear from this. What is odd is what follows on this downgrading of the men who made the revolution. One might assume that the project of placing Black Americans prominently in the role of democracy's defenders would mean replacing one set of white national heroes with a more genuinely heroic Black set, and that it might even do so in ways reminiscent of McGuffey and Bingham, with their emphasis on the connection between character and speech. Hannah-Jones does offer a list of Black defenders of democracy, defenders whose speeches and writings actually could easily fit into a McGuffian elocution paradigm, but Hannah-Jones chose not to go there. Beyond listing them, the 1619 Project hardly mentions any heroes. The 1619 Project thus obliquely recovers McGuffian personalism and concern with individual character, but only for negative ends, to tear down one pantheon of already quite battered heroes without replacing it with others. Hannah-Jones remains in this respect a direct descendant of Rugg and progressive history, only without its optimism. History is still governed by impersonal structures and systems. Individual agency, even of potentially heroic and brilliant individuals, like those on her list, David Walker, Ida B. Wells, is ultimately ineffective against the, quote, racist systems that have undergirded our society for 400 years. While Black agency suffers a grim prognosis, on Hannah-Jones's telling, the casual choices of long-dead whites like Jefferson and Washington reverberate in our lives to this day. It's easy today, I think, to deride the moralism and the naivete of textbooks like the Columbian Orator and the Eclectic Readers. But read in light of what followed, the 19th century paradigm is no more naive and simplistic than its successors. For all that we may charge Bingham and McGuffey with romanticizing the founders or flattening their complexities or elevating flawed men to undeserved heights, the textbook writers who followed them have done just the same for their preferred protagonists. Rugg's class-based analysis, despite its appeal to expertise, has many footnotes, is no less reductive. For Rugg, events arise from class conflict between two clearly delineated groups, the people and the ruling class. The people are never wrong, and the ruling class usually is. Yet for all its solicitousness for the people, Rugg was remarkably short-sighted about the possibility that the social planners running the government would form a new ruling class, whose technocratic training would render them contemptuous, to borrow his term, of the very people they had been appointed to serve. So too, texts like the 1619 Project or its predecessor, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, suffer from similar simplifications. In those books, the country is also divisible into two classes, the ruling class and its victims. Whereas Rugg concedes that the ruling class can occasionally act in the public interest when that interest is aligned with its self-interest, Hannah-Jones and Zinn depict those in power entirely as predatory villains. To be in power, to govern, is a fundamentally unethical activity, since in their telling, no one in American history has governed without oppressing. The only ethically acceptable alternative, and what they hope to cultivate in their readers by depicting the incessant villainy of the powerful, is protest and resistance against power. As a moral teaching, I think this is just as naive as Rugg's exhortation to technocracy for the sake of democracy. When protest and resistance are the highest form of citizenship, the skills and responsibilities of statesmanship are devalued, leaving only instability and incompetence in office. The increasingly utopian hopes that Americans have poured into schooling since the 1830s incline us to want a counter-pedagogical naivete with greater sophistication. But reduction and simplification, even to a degree that appears ridiculous to educated adults, is unavoidable in the teaching of history, which is always ultimately the task of instructing children with, on average, no great enthusiasm for the subject. The only question is who and what will be simplified and reduced? Heroes? Anti-heroes? Impersonal forces? What has remained notably consistent across American textbooks from the time of the Revolution itself to the present is a reverence for the Revolution that even those most intent on de-romanticizing America haven't been able to fully slough off. Even the project of impugning American hypocrisy rests on respect for the premises of the Declaration of Independence, the standard that successive generations can be accused of forsaking. What has changed, I think, is the gradual depreciation and occasional demonization of the individuals who signed the Declaration and made the revolution. But even if we endorse this depreciation, without individuals or much concrete context at all, the revolution becomes an incomprehensible, disembodied abstraction. 2 lines about self-evident truths plucked from an old parchment that constitute an ideal from an otherwise benighted past that we have somehow still failed to achieve in the present, but also should animate our future. Who can be surprised if students lose patience with such a convoluted vision?
Thanks, Rita. Thanks, Rita. Thanks, Bill. I'll have just one question, and then we'll turn it over to our friends who have joined us today. Here's my question. Rita, you spoke about textbooks. Bill, you spoke more broadly on education. There's only so many pages that you can fit in a textbook, so many hours in the school day. So some things have to be left unsaid. And at any given moment in time, things can be safely left unsaid. But surely that changes over time. And so in your study of the history of history, as you've all put it, I'm just curious, how has America grappled with this over time when suddenly things that could be safely left unsaid actually needed to be said affirmatively and explicitly? How does that change work over time?
You want to go first?
Sure. I mean, the best example, I think, actually comes from, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Jonathan Zimmerman's book, Who's America?, which is about the history of history wars. I mean, that's one of the things he focuses on. And one of the interesting things he describes is the way that ethnic groups have gotten themselves written into the sort of grand narrative of American history. And the way that they've done it, I mean, so you could say, well, there's a kind of narrative of American history in McGuffey, for example, that doesn't say much about the Irish or the Italians or the Polish or African Americans. It just talks about a few figures. And so what they did was kind of hitch their horse to the revolution. And so what's interesting, one of the things that Zimmerman writes about is that when progressive history starts to make it into the schools, the people who oppose this kind of progressive history, which tends to depreciate the revolution and treat the founders as just kind of business leaders who were concerned about their bottom line, the people who opposed it, I mean, you had on the one hand the Daughters of the American Revolution, the American Legion, all the patriotic groups you would expect, but then surprisingly you also had like the Knights of Columbus and these, Polish, Italian, ethnic groups, and their argument was, if you depreciate the revolution and the American founders, you're depreciating us because our only chance of making it into the pantheon is through people like Kazimierz Pulaski. Right, or Crispus Attucks. Like, we have our figures, and they were part of the revolution and the founding. And if you start to tell, America's children that the founding is not valuable or not heroic or not good, you're actually, you're demeaning Christopher Columbus, you're demeaning Kazimierz Pulaski, and so you're demeaning us as ethnic minorities. And so that was a really interesting way in which things that had gone unsaid got said, which is that all of these people got incorporated into the story of the American founding, so that you had like the role of, Polish Americans suddenly in the or just, Poles in the American founding, the role of Italians, the role of Germans, the role of the French, like the Marquis de Lafayette. What a great man. Guess what? He's also French. And so, so we are proud of him if we are French, right? So that kind of incorporation happened gradually, and it happened in this really interesting way in which actually it was a defense of the revolution and the sort of heroic nature of the revolution that became the means to incorporate ethnic groups that had previously not been a part of the sort of telling of American history.
That's great. Bill, my question in part was inspired by your point about, from time to time, our lack of shared meaning in American history, right? That changes over time, both what we share and how we see or don't see what we share. So how have we navigated that change over time?
I was thinking, as you talked a lot about the progressives, and that actually one example of when things become important to talk about is the progressives make a distinction between, someone like Charles Beard, between the Revolution and the Constitution. And there's what John Fiske called the critical period. And so talking about the founding as if it's a sort of unitary thing, instead of, well, there's a revolution, and then there's all sorts of contestation over what kind of form of government is going to come out. And because they're unhappy with the Constitution, they're unhappy with its bulkiness, its lack of sort of executive coordination, it's all sorts of obstacles to decisive and comprehensive action. They start to pick on the Constitution, and then on the Beard, of course, goes after the founders, the framers, for their supposed economic interests in the Constitution. But it's partly a distinction between the Revolution, which we don't make. You wouldn't have been surprised if I'd come here and talked about the founding.
Yeah.
And you've all talked about the founding quite a bit. The F word was used many times in his introductory remarks. Jack Green was...
You should hear him at our faculty meeting.
Yes. But as St. Jack's an old progressive, so he doesn't really like that conflation of the revolution, which is, someone like Beard. And by the way, Charles and Mary Beard wrote a very important textbook, The Rise of the American Nation.
They're the ones that got contested by the Knights of Columbus.
Okay, yeah, all right.
That was
right,
the first round. The
It's
1930s
actually very,
was later, yes.
Well, it's published just before the stock market crashed, so it's it kind of took itself out of business. But yet there is this notion, kind of an overlay of the French Revolution, that the Revolution was this time, the sort of Wordsworth time, and then you have the Thermidorian reaction of the Constitution. And the sort of old Federalist types come in, and Hamilton's a bad guy, really a bad guy for the most part in progressive theology. So there's a point where, for a while the distinction was very important to make. Now, not so much. There's a bit of a conflation of the Revolution and the Constitution that historically speaking is leaving out a lot.
Yeah, your last point, just an observation from me very briefly. It's easy to focus on the things that we don't like right now. For me personally, the attacks of the 1619 Project on the American founding and so on. But we also live in an era, especially since 1976, an era of truly amazing books on the founding, both for better and for worse. Right? We have Rick Brookhiser here in the audience. His book on Hamilton, maybe the first book to try to bring Hamilton back into the public consciousness in a positive way. Now we live in the era of Hamilton the musical, not to mention all the other books by you, Alan Gelzo, others, McPherson, and on, bringing these people back almost in the original way, telling stories, not fables, but stories about these people. And we're lucky to have these things now in a way that they didn't have 50 years ago. But anyway, I digress. Maybe we have time for one question. I'm sorry, I went on too long. There are microphones, so if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and the microphone will find you. Right here.
Thank you very much for your talks. It strikes me that what seems to run underneath both of your talks is a search for a sustaining moral imagination of the American founding that would hold us together. That seems to be fairly elusive in some ways. And I'm wondering, Rita, from your research, if you found any approaches that might do this, that could hold in tension, kind of the heroic aspect and the moral formation with critique. Did you find anything like that, that could be a kind of sustaining underlying story that holds those in tension? What comes to mind for me is, say, the way that MLK, approached American history, for instance. I think I'd also put Frederick Douglass in that approach, right, where you hold in tension. But there's still this, in contrast to the 1619 Project, what you're getting at, it's a very kind of dark and nefarious moral imagination. So I'm just wondering if you found that, and then I'm just wondering from each of you, where do you think we are right now in trying to get to that kind of sustaining moral imagination?
What a great question. Who wants to go first? Bill?
Well, just about, I was thinking about how much I admire Douglass. You mentioned him, who's both a strong, in the end, a strong proponent of both the Constitution and the Declaration. And I don't, I think the 1619 Project, I see we're running out of time here, but it was a missed opportunity. I think there should have been a attention paid, even though you can argue that it actually wasn't a significant event for various reasons that I don't want to go into in the history of slavery in America. But I think the way it should have been, if I had been king in a land with no kings, I would have said that we should have looked at W.E.B. Du Bois' discussion of in Souls of Black Folk of the spirituals, the slave songs, the sorrow songs, as he said, in which he says, and he has this wonderful passage, says, how came you to America? We were here before you were, a year before 1620. I'm not quoting him very well, but it's a beautiful passage in which that should have been, in my the New York Times, and I'm not only going to pick on whatever her name is, but should have stressed that Americans of African descent have been part of our history all along. Why didn't we do that? Why instead do we have this weird notion of anti-black racism being in the DNA of the country? That's the determinism. It's a very creepy notion, whatever cultural DNA is. There is no such thing as cultural DNA. But that deterministic and, as you say, dark vision did not have to be the way that we looked at 1619, and yet it was.
Rita, we only have a minute left. You get the last word.
Yeah, I think the synthesis that the 1619 Project points to is kind of already happening. And I think Zimmerman is largely right about his account of how American history works in America, right? Which is that what we do is we have a pantheon, and we incorporate more people into the pantheon, right? As groups sort of petition for incorporation, right? As they ask for incorporation, as they organize for it. And so I think what the incorporation of all, just to say like black figures or African American figures, right, raises the tension on its own. Because if you're going to do something like McGuffey's Readers, where you're going to focus on the individual stories, which I think is the thing that's missing and needs to be brought back, to focus on individual stories, biography, sort of to go back to what you're saying, and also speeches and elocution, right? The speeches are not, Frederick Douglass's speeches are not about sunshine and roses. Like the subject of the speeches, the subject of what you're actually teaching students is slavery, right? And is the fight against slavery, or is the fight for civil rights? And so I think the tension is incorporated simply by bringing those people into the pantheon, and that's basically how we have done it for the entire 20th century. I think Zimmerman is simply right about that. And it only works when it's kind of positive and optimistic, because otherwise, what happened to the 1619 Project? Got bushwhacked. A bunch of state legislatures have simply banned it because Americans don't like it. It's not the first time that has happened. because Americans do not like these kinds of stories, and after a while they get tired of them and they force them out. And they like much more optimistic stories, but also the pantheon is kind of open, right? And so I think that's sort of where we have gone in the past, and if the past is an indicator for the future, that's where we will go, is simply to expand the pantheon, and I hope to sort of bring back a little bit more personalism and rhetoric and elocution.
Well, thanks for such a great question. I want to say,
Yeah.
just in closing, we'll take a short break. Our next panel will be Pastor's Prologue, the Founding in American Life. But, I would also just like to add one last time, many thanks to Professor Kaminsky and the team at Monticello for hosting us, and please join me in thanking our guests today. Right.
If everyone could find their seats, I think we're going to start our next panel. All right. Hello. Yes. If we could all grab our seats, I know our next panel will prompt many, many questions. And so I want to make sure we have time for all of your questions because they have very strong opinions on the founding and culture. Since I'm standing here being a little bossy, I'll just stay up here. This panel needs no introduction. I know that's a cliche, but in fact, you've already met Jane and know her wonderful work here. Richard Brookhiser, senior editor at National Review, and I think was smiling through the first panel because Lafayette was mentioned, and he has a new book coming out about Lafayette in the spring, which I will encourage you all to pre-order. Alan Gelzo, my colleague at the American Enterprise Institute, who also has a new book out, which I was bending his ear about because it arrived at my household, and my college-age son and his friends were fascinated by it, The Golden Thread, the first of several in a history of Western civilization. So that's really what I'll say in terms of introduction. We're going to talk about culture, the founding, and I'm going to give each of the panelists a few minutes to just give you some broad themes, and then we'll have a conversation. So we're going to start with Richard, and then Jane, and then Alan.
Thank you. Thank you, Christine. Thank you, everybody. I'm just going to talk about the American Revolution now. Revolutions never end as long as they're remembered. They keep marching on. And I think it's in pretty good shape, actually, surprisingly good. And I just want to talk about books, dramas, and images. The revolution did pretty well in the academy for a long time. It did a lot better than my undergraduate discipline, which was English. I was class of '77, and English was succumbing to waves of theory, crazed European theory. And the teaching of the revolution not. And that was an artifact of some careers. Douglas Adair, who died kind of young, Edmund Morgan, Bernard Bailyn, and students of theirs, they decided when they were writing about the revolution, they wanted to know what the participants thought. You know, they didn't see them as conscripts in a class war. They knew that they all had ideas, and they wanted to understand what those ideas were. And so they approached them and their handiwork, their revolutionary handiwork, with a degree of seriousness. Well, those people are all retired now. They're all emeritus. One of them told me a few years ago, that, and he has since stepped down, but he said when he retired, he knew he was not going to be replaced by another specialist in his field. He was going to be replaced, he assumed, by a specialist in looms. You know, and what he meant by that was just, you know, the production of fabric and the people who produced fabric and the culture of weavers and humble folk. And not that that's unimportant or that you can't learn from it, but we both agreed there was more to be learned from the American crisis than from looms. So, but what happened is the intellectual work moved to book publishing. So the colleges weren't doing the job, so Amazon and Barnes & Noble stepped up. And you had popular authors who were serious, like David McCullough and Ron Chernow. And then academics who could write, like Morgan himself, like Joseph Ellis. And they produced a series mostly of biographies that were bestsellers, that racked up prizes. And I think what was happening is that what people weren't getting or hadn't gotten in college, they were getting from these books. Now, there were some attacks on this. There was an article in The Atlantic called Founder's Chic by H.W. Brands. And he said, are we really going overboard on all this? But of course, Bill Brands wrote a book on Franklin himself in 2000, and then he's got a book coming out next year about George Washington. So and I blurbed one of those books, and he's blurbed a couple of mine. So it seems like we shouldn't write about this too much, but we can't not. That's where he is. So I think in books, the revolution is holding up pretty well, taken pretty seriously. In drama, we've had two very serious musicals about the American Revolution in my lifetime. In 1969, the four contenders for the Tony for Best Musical were Zorba, Promises, Promises, Hair, and the winner, 1776. Now, 1776 is kind of a surprise choice. It's a very talky show. It's like a play with musical numbers inserted. There are only two women's parts, and they're both kind of small, and only one of them is good. Martha Jefferson, I'm sorry, really seems tacked on. Abigail Adams, it's a nice song, but it's tacked on. But Abigail and John, they really have something going there in their correspondence. The show presented three of the main characters very well. Adams, he's vain, he's contentious, and he's ardent. Franklin is jokey, but he's always savvy. And George Washington, who's off stage, is serious, determined, sending bulletins from the front. Jefferson is a bit of a cipher, which I think dramatically we understand because of his shyness and his reserve. So it doesn't damage the show or the historical record too much. The best song in the show is Rum, Molasses, and Gold. It's by Edward Rutledge of South Carolina, who is resisting a passage that Jefferson wrote blaming the slave trade on George III. I mean, he's happy with the slave trade. And when Northern delegates are trying to defend it, he walks to the footlights and he sings this dark song about the slave trade, complete with auctioneer's patter. And then there's a fight between Franklin and Adams. Do we compromise with this man? Franklin says yes because we're trying to get independence. Adams unhappily accepts it, but then he has a song where he has a vision that all Americans will be free. So that's the idealistic gloss, if you like, in the show. But then the show ends triumphantly. It ends with a tableau of all these men affixing their signatures. So it's a serious piece. It doesn't ignore problems, but net is very favorable. Now, the other musical, of course, is Hamilton, an American Musical, which I saw when it was off Broadway, and it just conquered the world. And there was a joke that the New York Times had a whole floor devoted to writers churning out pieces on it. I had a friend who his son was 12 years old at the time, and he was so obsessed with the musical, he claimed that if you asked him a question about anything, he could reply with an apposite quotation from the book of the musical. Now, and we've moved on a little bit. The Times moved on to the 1619 Project. My friend's son moved on to zombies. But the show is still running. I'm going to see it this weekend with some kids from Yale College who are coming down to see it, and then I'm going to hold forth afterwards about what it gets right and so on. And the show astonishingly gets a lot of detail, gets a lot right. The hero of the first act is Washington. He tells his protege Hamilton at one point, he says, dying is easy, young man, living is harder. So the lesson is, you know, you have to struggle and fight, and then after you win, you have more struggle. The second act, I'm sorry to say, is a Federalist campaign tract. And the antagonists are Jefferson and Madison. And Jefferson's character, I think, is modeled on Cab Calloway. He's presented as a fop, and Madison as a kind of a conniving gnome. And the heroes are Washington and Hamilton. The Federalists, they want to build a strong government and ultimately a multicultural society. And they're supposedly opposed to Jefferson and Madison in this. And that's faithful to the way we remember the Revolution. Jefferson and Hamilton never leave the Pantheon, but they go up and down like a mobile. You know, when one is up, the other is a little down, and then the other comes up, you know, and they sink. Jefferson had a very good 60 years, beginning with FDR, who put him on the tidal basin and on the nickel. And, you know, FDR, he wanted a Democrat. He wanted a Southerner. He wanted someone whose ideas opposed fascism. And he wanted a critique of Hamilton's rich friends. So he got all four with Jefferson. And then with the Civil Rights Movement and people began paying attention to Jefferson's, I would say, ultimately great record, but certainly problematic, and also to Sally Hemings, Jefferson begins to sink a little. Hamilton, who helps found the New York Manumission Society, begins to rise a little. And this will just keep going on. So those are two perennials in our musical theater literature. And then the final area is images. You know, it's not verbal, it's not even words and songs, but images. And people have been making images of leaders and rulers and conquerors for centuries, millennia. The two that we have, there's Washington crossing the Delaware. This was painted in 1850 by Emanuel Leutze. He was a German who'd been raised in Philadelphia, and then he moved back and forth between America and Europe. And in 1850, he wanted a painting to hearten European liberals who had been hopeful with the revolutions of 1848 and then dismayed by their failure. So he did the American Revolution. And when you look at the men in the lead boat, David Hackett Fisher pointed out in Washington's Crossing that they're a regional collection. They're Virginia gentlemen, they're Philadelphia merchants, there are New England sailors, and they're backwoodsmen. And he said they're all in the same boat, literally and politically and emotionally. There's also a black oarsman in the boat, which is historically accurate because the 14th Massachusetts was manning the boats that night. They were from Marblehead, had black and Indian sailors in that regiment. So Leutze's painting ended up in the Metropolitan Museum. It regularly makes the list of the most visited favorite piece that they own. And it got a new frame a few years ago. They gave it a frame like the one it originally had. Nice gold, elaborate, not overwhelming, but really makes it pop. The second painting is by a man I wrote a book about, John Trumbull. He was a veteran, fought in the Revolution. His father was the governor of Connecticut. He knew everybody. And when he was a 30-year-old in Europe studying painting, he decided that he wanted not just to paint portraits or a scene. He wanted to tell the whole story of the Revolution. It took him 45 years, but he ended up with 8 paintings that now hang in Yale art gallery. He gave them to Yale when he was an old man. There are 5 larger copies in the Hartford Athenaeum, but there are 4 life-size copies in the Rotunda of the Capitol. That's where millions of people see them when they pass through it. And 8 of his original 8, 6 of them have to do with battles or surrenders. Only 2 of them are civilian. But of course, the most famous one is the Declaration of Independence, which shows the Continental Congress. And this is the painted equivalent of 1776. Here's the moment where the drafting committee hands the Declaration. Jefferson hands his Declaration to John Hancock. And we can't read the words on the piece of paper, but the painting tells us a lot about the country they want to found. One thing is they're all civilians. There's a war going on because we see British trophies hanging on the wall behind them. But all these men are in civilian clothes. This is not a military revolution. It's not like Haiti. It's not like Latin America. It's not like what France will become. The other thing is they're all peers. Some of them were extremely wealthy. When Charles Carroll of Maryland signed, somebody cracked, there go a few millions. Others were prosperous, but they're all dressed approximately the same way. No one's wearing a diadem. No one is wearing an insignia of nobility or an ermine. There are no aristocratic orders in this assembly. And then the third thing is they're all deliberating. Well, they have deliberated. Now they're going to act on what they've decided. When Trumbull was in Europe, he saw Jacques-Louis David's Oath of the Horatii with these 3 noble Romans giving salutes to their father as they prepare to defend Rome from its enemies. And those salutes reappeared in the Oath of the Tennis Court that he sketched at the beginning of the French Revolution. And it's passionate and it's engaged, and it also suggests violence to come. And these men are running a war. They're sending people to their deaths. Some of them will be captured by the enemy, but here they have been deliberating. That's the kind of country they want to set up and that they hope will survive. So millions of people see both those paintings every year. I would say they're in our mind's eye, in the country's mind's eye. And that's not bad. You have a shelf of books. You got 2 musicals, 2 great paintings. We could do a lot worse.
When Yuval reached out to ask me to contribute an essay to a volume on American culture, I thought this seemed like an opportunity to ask one of the truly great historical questions. Questions like, why is there no socialism in America? Or was the Civil War inevitable? Or is the Constitution a living text? The big question that I wanted to tackle, and tackled with some of my colleagues here at Monticello, is why has there never been even a decent movie about the American Revolution? I was thinking during Bill McClay's talk earlier that it's not a trivial question, right? The movies are where we find ourselves alone together in the dark, as Pauline Kael so famously put it. They're a place of felt connection, of membership, even potentially of civic love. And yet, for as long as there have been movies, there have been terrible movies about the American Revolution. The first one by Thomas Edison in 1896. Throughout that century and a quarter, movies about the beginnings of the United States have been almost without exception, to use a technical term, stinkers. Generations of decorated playwrights, novelists, historians, lyricists, and dramaturgs, top-grossing directors, bankable stars from Cary Grant to Mel Gibson, all have foundered on the shoals of the American Revolution, producing neither a standard-setting work of history nor of film, let alone both. And to consider some counter cases, there's no American Revolution battle picture with the punch in the gut impact of Glory or Saving Private Ryan or Platoon. Amazingly, given the pantheon element that we heard about in the previous panel, there's no biopic with the insight of Lincoln or Patton or even of Amadeus if we're looking for something set in the 18th century. Despite the prolonged impact of the Long War on those left behind and a profusion of excellent recent scholarship on women and looms and traveling with the Army, there is no home front American Revolution drama like Best Years of Our Lives or Deer Hunter. And there's been no cinematic breakthrough like Birth of a Nation was for the Civil War in its aftermath, though Griffiths made an American Revolution movie. If his redemptionist spectacle wrote history with lightning, as Woodrow Wilson is wrongfully alleged to have said, his revolution picture, America or Love and Sacrifice, in 1924, wrote history with a soggy breadstick. So in the essay that I wrote, I make the argument that the failures in all their box office bombing glory have something to tell us not only about the shifting shapes of American culture, but also about the ways that we understand and study the revolution itself. And the first is that the directors fail in part because they confront a knowledge void, connecting to Rita's wonderful paper on education. We, the people, really don't know the story of the American Revolution all that well, as instruments like the National Assessment of Educational Progress tell us again and again. And so this gives movie makers, as a particular kind of synoptic story, the challenge of telling everything that came before, not knowing where to begin, not knowing where to settle, not knowing how to end. The problem of everything, everywhere, all at once. The revolution doesn't have the kinds of engines of memory behind it that the Civil War does, nor the living memory of World War II just now passing and Vietnam, which will be with us for decades to come. And so many feature film makers have forced themselves to act as teachers or documentarians, in part because they can't presume common knowledge of a complex, long-ago conflict, especially when the instructional energies devoted to it have been scant and arguably miscast, as Rita argued in the previous panel. The second feature that I think these movies point out is that it's very hard to make money with a historical film that creates an act of, that requires an act of world building. One of the films that I speak about in the essay is Alan Alda's movie within a movie, historical comedy Sweet Liberty, and as a character in that movie says, successful movies need young audiences, and young audiences want to see three things, quote, defy authority, destroy property, and take people's clothes off. The American Revolution in lived experience had all of those, of course, but it's worth noting that a movie without an audience is a failure. If people won't pay to see it, producers and distributors will lose money, and if they lose money, they won't reinvest in the subject again. The threshold for period dramas is higher. They're very expensive to make, although that is also true, for example, of Lord of the Rings. The only American Revolution film that I've researched that has even remotely earned out was Roland Emmerich's dreadful 2000 feature, The Patriot, which grossed about $215 million globally, less than half that internationally, compared to the billions for the Lord of the Rings epic, for example. And if you think that this is partly about national boundaries, right? A movie like Lord of the Rings is not set, it's actually not set in a real place, it turns out. Consider the fact that Das Boot in 1981-82 earned hugely on a small investment, and more than 80% of its box office gross outside of Germany. So it is possible, but we haven't done it. I think the real failing here is that most American Revolution films have tended to probe highly specific rather than transcendent questions. So the question of Das Boot is the question of Die Hard and of Apollo 13. Do I have what it takes to get out of here? And can I save somebody else? The genius of Miranda's Hamilton, which I have not counted as a film, is that its questions aren't bound by time even when its history is accurate. Its questions are in the very first lines of the libretto. How does a bastard orphan son of a whore grow up to be a hero and a scholar? That's a question for Zola or Dickens or Toni Morrison or Philip Roth or even for Freud, not just for Ron Chernow. The breakout American Revolution film yet to be made will pose that kind of question and answer it only accidentally in breeches and powdered wigs. The third element that I think has been missing in most Revolution films is the element of story that our first panel called out so strongly. Brandon Dillard, who directs our historic interpretation efforts here at Monticello, made the point when a group of us were watching these films together that a historic film is somewhat like the journey through a historic site. And Brandon said, no amount of content knowledge will make a good tour. Only a great story can do that. I think it's telling that Richard Brookhiser and I, who have very different sensibilities and bodies of work and have written very different essays, both find a lot to praise in Peter Hunt's 1776, which played Broadway in that revolutionary year of 1969 and was filmed as a fully imagined production, not as a filmed play as Hamilton was in 1972. We think of it as a bicentennial production, but it wasn't really. Fun fact, the only theatrical release about the revolution in 1976 was the hardcore film Spirit of 76, starring John C. Holmes, which I must say for our HR department, I did not screen with Monticello's staff. What I want to call attention to in the film 1776 is the power of minimalism. It's a ship in the bottle conceit, as they call that kind of episode. Everybody with brief digressions, mostly in the theater of the mind, is locked in a room. It has a narrow number of protagonists, a tightly controlled timeline. It embraces, in other words, the power of synecdoche. And by gosh and by golly, with the power of synecdoche, we know what the fight is about. Both the war for home rule and the war for who will rule at home, bringing those halves of the progressive dilemma that Bill McClay talked about earlier together. We can sense in this tightly controlled staging the tensions of the future, the cleavages of race and condition and section that would roil the nation for generations to come, and to an extent roil it still. Without synecdoche, right, the literary device of taking the part for the whole, historical cinema becomes a visual encyclopedia. War pictures, if you think about war pictures as a genre, across a wide swath of time and space, harness the power of synecdoche as few other genres do. We let the brigade, or the battle, or the camp, or the casualty, or the grunt, or the general, or the sadistic commandant stand as the sort of profound, clair moral center for the whole, the grain of sand that contains dizzying worlds. So in Glory, for example, we allow Robert Gould Shaw and the brave, doomed men of the Massachusetts 54th to represent the tensions within the North, between the North and the South, and the moral arc of the Civil War, and the vicissitudes of the war itself, all in a tight 2 hours. Why don't we do that for the American Revolution? I think the profession of history bears some responsibility. We have focused, as both Bill and Rita said in the previous panel, for the last generations on the complexity and fractures of the American population in the founding era, which are indeed hard to overstate. Complex in loyalties, in geography, in priorities. In our recent historiography, the cause is no longer glorious nor even common. In the most towering recent synthesis, many and various and often conflicting American revolutions are the title of the book, intersecting in unpredictable ways across a vast and divided continent without a country necessarily in sight. That's a more accurate picture. If a more pixelated one, we need to hold all of these truths in order to hold any of them. But it's not the stuff of a good movie. All this e pluribus pluribus does not an easy cinematic triumph make any more than it makes for good moral education in our civics and history classrooms. And then finally, I'll call to mind the challenge of endings for telling an American Revolutionary War story at the movies. In all of the films that we screened together here, there was this tendency to telescope forward in time until it was all settled. Some films even looking ahead until the second founding after the American Civil War. Ken Burns's new series, which is a towering filmic act in many ways, goes all the way in its coda to the March on Washington in 1963. In other words, we're unwilling to leave it in the muddle of the middle. It's a hard moment to cut off. And here, I think, as Richard said a few moments ago, 1776 is kind of a glorious outlier. The end of the film, and it's even more possible to do in film than it was in theater, is this remarkable freeze frame where the signers dissolve into Trumbull's picture, freezing the moment just as the clock strikes on July 4th of 1776. Actually, it should have been August 2nd because they're engrossing the paper, but never mind. So what does it mean to freeze the frame and think about the revolution as a sort of frozen moment, unfinished, to leave us in the middle, and to pass the burden of history to the audience, which is a thing that good movies do. A republic, if you can keep it, as Franklin is probably more accurately alleged to have said. In a medium dedicated to entertainment, this is surely an essential move to give the audience something to do. Maybe historians should think about it more often too. The American Revolution is not over. Let Abigail Adams from 1776 sing the point home. It's yours, yours, yours. Thanks.
I want to begin with an impromptu footnote to what Jane was saying, but to talk not so much about musicals, but about music. And that is, I was approached several months ago by the music director of an orchestra, to ask about what I would recommend for a musical program for his orchestra for the year to come. I sat down and thought about it, and I suggested, all right, let's do this. Do George Antheil's overture, McConkey's Ferry, which is about Washington's crossing of the Delaware. Then go to William Schumann's New England Triptych, settings of 3 tunes of William Billings for orchestra. Then do Charles Ives' Putnam's Camp from 3 places in New England, or else Washington's Birthday from American Holidays. And then end up with Randall Thompson's Testament of Freedom. And I suggested those as possible items to the program because at the end of that list, I didn't have anything more to recommend. I'd hit the bottom of the barrel. In the event, he decided not to do the Antheil overture, would do Schumann's New England triptych because it's pretty easy to play. But he will under no circumstances whatsoever attempt the Charles Ives, which is a great loss because if there's anything in American music about the American Revolution which captures the atmosphere of both dread and celebration together, it is Ives writing the movement known as Putnam's Camp from Three Places, or the Washington's Birthday movement from Holidays. So even there, we find ourselves at a loss in terms of the kind of music that is supposed to remember and to celebrate the American Revolution. So that's simply a footnote to all of your footnotes. I'm going to talk about something a little different. Here's a story. Yesterday, the 4th of July, announced the newspaper, being the anniversary of the independence of the United States of America, was celebrated in this city with demonstrations of joy and festivity. Each of the armed ships and galleys in the river were dressed in the gayest manner, with the colors of the United States and streamers displayed. And at 1 o'clock, all gun crews on board began firing a discharge of 13 cannon from each of the ships. There was a dinner for members of Congress, officers of the Army, and even strangers of eminence. All followed by toasts breathing independence and a generous love of liberty, and more banging of artillery. It was, all in all, said the newspaper, quite a celebration, especially considering as it was the first ever such celebration, because it was July 4th, 1777. And it took place in Philadelphia, which in less than 3 months would be occupied by an unforgiving British army. But there was a grand exhibition of fireworks, which began and concluded with 13 rockets. And the Pennsylvania Evening Post solemnly hoped that the 4th of July, that glorious and ever memorable day, would be celebrated through America by the sons of freedom from age to age till time shall be no more. Now, judging strictly by the numbers, the Evening Post would probably be very satisfied at how energetically we've carried on these celebrations of American independence. Because in 2024, the American Pyrotechnics Association, there is such a thing, estimated that 16,000 professional fireworks shows lit up the nighttime skies across the nation on July 4th. You thought that Aurora Borealis was something? Coney Island played host to its annual hot dog eating contest, which usually produces fireworks of another sort. Philadelphia hosted its Pomp and Parade March on Independence Mall, and the Boston Pops did its annual Independence Day concert on the Charles River Esplanade, featuring Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. But despite the exuberance, there was still some question about how to draw a line between 1777 and its hope that independence would be celebrated as glorious, and the way we've actually done it today. The 1812 Overture was, after all, written in honor of the triumph of an absolute monarchy, the Russian imperial one, over France's kindred revolution for liberty. And it represents the diametric opposite of what the American revolutionaries thought that they were doing. In Philadelphia, the African American Museum featured a reenactment of Frederick Douglass's famous skeptical inquiry. What to the slave is the 4th of July? If anything, it's become more conventional, even among professional historians, to speak of the American Revolution not as the work of the sons of freedom, but as an internal civil war of extraordinary violence justified by the rhetoric of a country in peril and folded into a terror erupting with particular force by white revolutionaries on Tories, on local white minorities, and on African and Native Americans. but then crowded out of the master narrative by the invocations of the glorious cause. Now, perhaps such skepticism about the American Revolution is the product of living in skeptical times, when institutions and narratives have surrendered much of their persuasive power to those arguments which reduce all human events to unpleasant questions of power, in the spirit, we should say, of La Rochefoucauld's reduction of virtue to nothing but, il n'y a rien, or to Michel Foucault's preference for pessimistic activism. But it stands in vivid contrast not only to the observances in Philadelphia in 1777, but to the recollections of an earlier American historian, George Bancroft, writing as a student at the University of Göttingen in 1820. "Oh, my countrymen, never was a land blessed of heaven like ours. My countrymen, we are Americans. The arts and sciences of Europe cannot make us forget it." Far from understanding the American Revolution as a domestic tug of war over privilege and oppression, Abraham Lincoln spoke in 1861 of the battlefields and struggles for the liberties of the country as an emblem of a great promise to all people of the world to all time to come. And yet there always has been a critical overtone to American remembrances of its revolutionary birth. Frederick Douglass's famous question on the platform of Corinthian Hall in Rochester in 1852 was not an exercise in cynical fatalism. It was a frank exposure of a great default on the revolution's promise, which, as Douglass said, brought life and healing to you, but has brought stripes and death to me. And even Lincoln was painfully candid when he admitted that although the 4th of July has not quite dwindled away in significance, the spirit of freedom that Philadelphians saluted in 1777, that spirit which desired the peaceful extension of slavery, has itself become extinct with the occasion and the men of the Revolution, and left the 4th of July, Lincoln said, good for little more than burning firecrackers. Some of that ambivalence about the Revolution was in American minds almost from the beginning. Sarah Logan Fisher, a Philadelphia loyalist who sat unhappily through the 1777 anniversary events, thought of the revolutionaries as an ungrateful set of men who did not understand the kindness and lenity of British rule, and who still go on working their own destruction and will one day, no doubt, reap the reward of their works. But loyalism was a minority voice, and even more to the point, it lost. This allowed the revolutionaries free rein over the course of the first generation of the new republic to cast the revolution in terms of almost redemptive glory. In the generation which stretched from 1776 until 1826, Americans believed, according to David Ramsay, the first historian of the Revolution, they believed with little dissent that the old colonists were, from their first settlement in America, devoted to liberty, and endowed them with the rights of life, liberty, and as much liberty as was consistent with the rights of others. The revolution, he said, was the unanswerable and invulnerable bulwark of freedom, the rights of man. And from the 1790s onward, public readings of the Declaration of Independence on successive 4ths of July became a kind of American political ritual and a definition of the rights of man. By the 50th anniversary of the Revolution, the way it was fixed in American memory had begun to diverge along two separate paths, or at least around two distinct objects of remembrance. One of these would be the Revolution itself, whose attention would be focused on celebrating the events and personalities of the revolutionary era, and that especially grouped itself around observations of the 4th of July. The other stream of understanding and remembering the revolution would center around the ideas of the revolution, especially as captured in the Declaration of Independence. These were not necessarily exclusive, but still, as the United States moved past the 50th anniversary of the revolution, it wasn't difficult to hear two voices, sometimes singing in harmony, sometimes as solos. There was no shadow in these events of a question about the achievement of the revolution itself. When the Marquis de Lafayette paid his 50th anniversary visit to the United States in 1824, Charles Ingersoll marked out the lines of great and beneficent changes the revolution had wrought. In a speech that he gave in front of Lafayette, Ingersoll declared, "The people have come to be treated with the respect of other sovereigns. And through the example of the revolution, the political, intellectual, and physical state of man is generally improved and improving." The gospel of the American Revolution, said Ingersoll, inculcates universal education, throws open all careers to all, superadds chemistry and natural philosophy to the arts of life, and political economy to the sciences of government, enacts laws by equal representation, simplifies their enforcement, restrains sparingly, punishes mildly, discourages hostilities. Remembering the Declaration, by contrast, took a much more controversial path. And it became clear from the 1830s onwards that the source of that division was slavery, whose continuation half of the country was increasingly unhappy with, and which the other half was determined to justify. Here, the goodness of the revolution itself was not the question, but its principles were, and especially the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And since those principles were the pole star of the abolition movement, for the pro-slavery forces, the Declaration had to be somehow diminished or reinterpreted to satisfy the demands of legal enslavement. Nobody offered a more wholesale rejection of the Declaration's principles than that apex of pro-slavery apologists, John Caldwell Calhoun. For Calhoun, the Declaration embodied not a bedrock for the edifice of liberty, but a gigantic mistake in racial judgment. All men are not created equal, Calhoun announced. And with that, the purpose of the revolution shrank down to a trade dispute with Great Britain. Only slightly less mincing was the judgment of Henry St. George Tucker. In his law lectures, the individual colonies had already declared their independence, individually and practically, before the Declaration was even composed. It was from that moment, before the Declaration, that all dependence on and connection with Great Britain absolutely and forever ceased. In fact, no declaration by the Continental Congress was even necessary, said Tucker. Only a decent respect for the opinions of mankind required a declaration of the causes which impelled the separation and was proper to give notice of the event to the nations of Europe. What lay immediately behind Tucker's argument was the conviction that the states had staked out their own sovereignty before the collective declaration of July 1776 and were thus entitled to resume it once slavery seemed to be under threat. This diminishment of the Declaration generated in turn a revulsion on the part of anti-slavery activists who were incredulous at the proposition that the revolution had done nothing to promote either national unity or an end to slavery. We, the boasted pattern for the world, we cut down the banner of freedom, complained a contributor to the Oberlin Evangelist 4 months after Calhoun made his announcement, and planted in its stead the black flag of slavery. It would take a bloody civil war to lay Calhoun's dissent in the dust, led by a president who protested that he had never had a feeling politically that did not spring from the sentiments embodied in the Declaration of Independence, and who believed that the outcome of the war would reestablish the Republic on the proposition that had been articulated 77 years before. In that respect, the Civil War was really a war to decide the long-term outcome of the revolution, whether it was strictly an 18th century political event or whether it embodied ideas with irresistible and ongoing application. Now, time on this panel, and I'm looking at the clock, pointing its accusing finger at me, time on this panel will permit me to dive no further deeper. The intention, however, in the essay that will emerge from this is to take the question up to the Progressive era, which represented another drastic reshaping of the idea of the Declaration and the Revolution, which was, in fact, in many ways a repudiation of the revolutionary event, with echoes that are easy to recognize in a new, professionalized, and more skeptical American historical consciousness. For the 250th anniversary that lies before us, we may expect the importance of the Declaration and its ideas to swell in significance and attention. The events and personalities of the Revolution will continue to shrink in comparison. There will be moments of exception to this, but those moments of exception will lack serious cultural power, as Americans are persuaded more and more to turn their attention to the document rather than to the event that gave them an identity. The Zinn Educational Project and the 1619 Project will, at least in the short run, probably have exerted far greater influence in reshaping the image of the revolution than the DAR. The 250th anniversary of the revolution thus presents us with a moment for celebration, and then almost at the same time, in many quarters, denies us a reason for it. Perhaps, however, the original alliance of the revolution and the Declaration can be rejuvenated. And that rejuvenation may, in fact, be the best recipe for a 250th anniversary, which reminds us and assures us, as Benjamin Rush believed, that the American Revolution is not over.
Well, thank you all for those wonderful remarks. I'm going to, I would say thread a needle, but there are so many threads that we're touching on. So I'm going to pose a pretty broad question and encourage you three to take it in any direction you want. I've been struck both by the first panel today and our discussion just now about storytelling being a concern. How do we tell stories? And also the tension among historians about whether the revolution should be told as the story of an idea or the story of a series of events of great men. But what I'm gleaning from what you all have said today is that it's also, the revolution is also a question. And whether or not it's been answered is one of the things we're still fighting over, and how we teach that question. So when we think about what's in our cultural mind's eye, as Richard noted, these amazing images, these indelible images of the revolution and of the founders, I will sound a little skeptical here, because I'm curious what you each think about whether the medium matters in how we teach each generation about the founding. And by that I mean generations raised without a chronological sense of history, a very fragmented view of the past, a very fragmented daily life where most of their information comes in little snippets, usually on a small screen. So we worry about no common culture, but nowadays we don't even have a common pop culture. So I'm curious how you would see both, whether it's public events, commemorating something, paintings, movies. How can culture sort of push back against that fragmentation and get us to a point where the founding story can be told? Nobody wants to take this question. Somebody jump up.
Look, good stories beat bad ones.
Okay.
Good stories beat bad ones. And the revolution is full of good stories and is a good story. We mentioned the 1619 Project. The good story there is the story of enslavement and exodus, in the Bible, being recapitulated with Black Americans. The rest of it is a terrible story. It's not a story. It's like, oh, our prosperity came from slavery. Well, that's economics. Who understands economics? Who cares where our prosperity came from? I mean, that's a sort of a trivial Marxist, sub-Marxist point. Forget about it. But as I said, good stories will beat bad ones. My painter, John Trumbull, said he wanted to give the present and future sons of misfortune glorious lessons of their rights and how to uphold and maintain them. Because you're right, it doesn't end. You know, when you feel oppressed, when you start yelping, you'll look back to the American Revolution. You will, because that's what those people felt then, and they were right. The imperial system was being tightened, and the intent was to tighten it further, and then they acted. So when these situations recur, as Alan said, they did before the Civil War and then during the Civil War. When they come back, we'll come back to this revolution.
And not only, I'd add this, not only is this a prescription for Americans, I was struck some 3 years ago when there were great disturbances in China over COVID lockdowns of a very severe nature. And there were riots in some of the streets in China. And I remember having seen a video of a young Chinese student standing at a police barricade, shouting in Mandarin at the top of his voice. What was he shouting? The translation went like this: "Give me liberty or give me death." That was the moment when the phrase, "the revolution is not over," came burning into my mind. And I thought, all right, here is this example translating itself into the language and the experience of people around the world. The stories that can emerge out of the revolution are marvelous stories, I think in large measure, not because we just cherry pick good stories, but because so many of the actors in the revolution were conscious of the fact that they were doing something new. They were at the beginning of something different, and therefore they had to do the right thing at that moment, because further on down they weren't going to be able to correct any mistakes they were going to make. And there are some wonderful stories that are told in the memoirs of Elias Boudinot. And Boudinot, who had been in the Continental Congress, who had served as a link between the Congress and the Continental Army, one story in particular struck me very forcibly. Boudinot was told by a local farmer that a neighbor of his, yet another farmer, had betrayed the password of the Continental Army's encampment at Morristown to General Cornwallis, to the British. And this farmer wanted Boudinot to communicate this to Washington. So Boudinot goes to Washington and says, look, I have a friend, he wants to remain anonymous because he needs to get along with his neighbors, but he wants you to know that his neighbor betrayed the password. Washington said, do you realize what you're asking me to do? You're asking me to respond to take action against, to punish a third party on an anonymous denunciation that this person can't even reveal who they are, and you want me to act on the basis of that? And Boudinot said afterwards, he felt like the 18th century equivalent of 1.5 inches high. He had gone to Washington, well, this is a matter of military importance. Washington will surely respond to this. And Washington's response was, I can't do that. And he's conscious, Washington is conscious of the fact he's setting these precedents that are going to play themselves out long term in the future. I thought, now there is a remarkable story, and Boudinot is not telling this with a view towards lighting a candle at the shrine of Washington. He's simply saying, here was the decision by this man. It was the right decision. I was trying to get him to do the other thing. And I realized as soon as he said it, he was right. Those stories are stories which light paths, not only to the life of this republic, but to human flourishing in general. And you can tell these stories over and over again out of the revolution. And I mean, Rick, Jane, you know these stories. We could sit here all afternoon and retell them because they're worth the retelling. But I think there are great stories that come out of this event, and they help to guide us. And yes, the good stories like that, they beat the bad stories.
So I think another way of recasting Rita's really interesting trajectory from Weems to the McGuffey Reader to the sort of scientific, the social scientific history of the 20th century is that historians who since Herodotus had been storytellers confronted a set of incentives in the modern world to do something other than tell stories. And as you've said, we lost our audience, right? We lost our audience to the McCulloughs and the Rick Atkinsons. I think just a masterly craftsman of
Narrative.
plot, character, and setting, right? I think that the story, so I think historians, professional historians, need to recover the art of storytelling because that's where the audience is. Good stories are true, and good stories show people in their predicaments. And I think in historical context, that means good stories show the contingency of the time, right? That one of the things that we try to recover in our storytelling here about Jefferson and the people of the mountaintop was that they did not know how it was going to turn out. This is incredibly banal and commonplace, but we forget it because we look at this history backwards on the Capitol Rotunda or on the massive wall from which the Metropolitan Museum couldn't possibly move Deloitte's painting because there's no place else big enough to put it. So
It couldn't get out the door.
true stories that show people in predicaments. I think a lot in the context of Monticello, what we want people to do with those stories, and Bill McClay used the word emulation a lot. I think that's right, but not complete, right? Emulation is not reverence, and I think that's important. The heroes of a republic are people who we look eye to eye with, not people who we should look either like this or like that. I think we also want to offer stories that make people look at themselves rigorously, right? Because a republic is a continual baton pass, as Lincoln knew, and as Jefferson, Jefferson perhaps more insistent on this than most, right? Thought that we should tear it all down and do it all again every 19 years. So when I think of our story here at Monticello, it's not that they emulate Jefferson, although certainly they should learn something about their ideas. It's that they think of a young man in the predicament of history, right? A 32, 33-year-old in 1776, who was really quite ordinary in all respects except his talent, and who confronted
Same thing could be said about Mozart.
Of course, right? About any human being who does a great thing, right? Who dug deep in his talents to do an extraordinary thing in extraordinary times. What I want for our stories is for ordinary Americans to find that place within themselves.
Okay,
Trumbull begins his series of 8 with 2 defeats.
that's right.
Bunker Hill and Quebec. And there's a lot of dead Americans in those first 2 paintings.
Well, I have many more questions for these 3, but I think I'd like you all to have a chance. Now, please keep your questions succinct so that others can ask one, and otherwise I will say, sit down, John. That's a 1776 joke for those of you who've seen it. We have
I bet we
microphone?
could get a rousing rendition going in this.
I know,
round.
a sing-along. That should have been all right, we've got one here.
We did that, actually.
You
with
did a
staff.
sing-along?
Yeah,
Oh,
we did a
that's
staff
fantastic.
sing-along.
Great.
Thank you very much. That was a wonderful panel. I want to pick up the thread of storytelling and ask if there are examples of great fiction, great novels in particular, about the Revolution. I know James F. Cooper wrote a couple that nobody reads anymore. And then along those lines, whether there are any great recent television depictions of the Revolution. I can think of maybe the HBO miniseries John Adams, the SNL sketches about Washington's dream. But I wondered if you guys think there are any others, and if not, why do you think? What explains the absence there?
The Turn.
One of Yuval's favorite shows,
Yeah,
actually.
That's a good show.
Yeah, I know the story runner. Alex Rose was a colleague of mine at a National Review for a few years, and his book, Washington Spies, is what generated the show. Good book.
I think the serial form has been more successful for filmic portrayal, and it's because you do episodes and you aren't confronted with the impulse to do the whole thing all at once. And the HBO John Adams, I think, is exemplary. I am really excited about the Burns film in the same way, right? You've got 6 hours and 12 episodes, and it's a bigger canvas. On historical novels, I think they're mostly pretty terrible, the historical novels of the American Revolution. I wrote one, which is excellent, and a break with that pattern. The novelist who I think all historians should find ways to emulate is Hilary Mantel in the Cromwell trilogy, right? And that's if you think about this paradox of wanting to immerse and wanting to give somebody something to emulate, you start in the mud, right? You're literally looking at the shoe of somebody kicking a young person in the head. You're just in the middle of it. I think she is just a masterful artist in fiction, and I wrote a piece once about what historians could take from that work as they craft stories.
Rip Van Winkle. Rip Van Winkle sleeps through the American Revolution. Sort of a negative story.
To come back to Cooper, Cooper wrote a pretty extensive series of novels connected with the Revolution, whether it was The Spy or The Pilot.
The prequel, This Last of the Mohicans.
Yeah, I mean, even that long series that he does of Natty Bumppo, it really begins before the Revolution and then moves after the Revolution to its consequences. And there were a lot of revolutionary novels that were published in the 19th century. I think of the American Winston Churchill, not the British Prime Minister, but the American novelist in the 1890s, who, again, wrote a series following one family from colonial times up through the Civil War. And that, too, had a volume devoted to the American Revolution. One piece of fiction which stuck in my mind from my own childhood was a children's novel, Johnny Tremaine. And I hear intimations from everyone here. Yeah, I read that, which as far as I know is still in print, still in circulation. There were wonderful renditions of events of the Civil War, of the Revolution, in the Landmark series of American history books that were published by Random House in the 1950s and 60s. Those were supposed to be nonfiction, although I have to say large components of them did sometimes resemble fiction. But there is a genre of American revolutionary fiction. Has it been explored by literary critics? That I don't know. I'm not a lit person, so to speak. If it hasn't been explored, you now have an opportunity.
I'm a Cooper fan, and you have to admit he cannot write a sentence, but he can write a paragraph.
That's, yes.
Which is one sentence.
He writes stories and creates situations and he invented the Western. I mean, it happens in upstate New York, but he invented the Western.
There's no such thing as a soundbite in James Smith.
Okay. Gentleman right here. Oh, then him.
Hello. Yeah, what I was curious about is how do you reform universities? I look at my university, I was a history major, and then I look at the history department. It's a hodgepodge of stuff all over the place. There are no more university level survey courses, those are gone. About 10 years ago, I ran into a friend of mine whose son wanted to be a history major. He said, I could just make it through if certain guys don't leave or die or something like that. But the traditional history, as we know it, doesn't seem to be taught anymore, or social history. How can you change that so more students get the history bug and then want to follow more and write more and read more about the American Revolution?
Well, assign all of these folks books, for one. That would bring more students in.
So I thought a lot about this question in the classroom, Walter, and I think there's a lot of learning to be done from the hard sciences, actually, right? Like, you don't become a chemistry major and be told that you're going to spend your first 3 years reading about the history of chemistry and the fights between chemists, and then maybe if you persevere, you'll get to do some experiments. You start in the 4th grade building a volcano out of baking soda and vinegar, right? So I thought a lot about what does that look in the history classroom, especially for Americanists, where the documents are all now digitized and free range. What can we do with sort of case study and build your own experiment methods? Kids working on a local graveyard to find out the stories of everybody who's in it could give you pretty much all of American history. So I think there are experiments like that going on. They're not going on at scale. I think the survey is dead. I fought against that for many years. But now we have all the content in all the world in the device in your pocket. So when we think about how we'll flip classroom education to take advantage of the fact that we're no longer just content provider at scale, I feel like the sciences, with the sort of sciences in business schools, with the case study method and the experimental method, have a lot to recommend. I guess I'm more concerned, and I think I will have productive disagreement with others in the room. I would rather have students that understand how to know something than students who can answer. I don't actually care if we skip the War of 1812, right? Like, I think the seamless coverage fabric model has probably been outpaced by technology. So letting them go deep, whether that's into a battle, into a place, into a character, and produce things other than papers that are written by ChatGPT and read only by the professor.
Yes, the McGuffey reader might not make a comeback, but blue books are, evidently, in the classroom.
Yes. And recitations.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else want to tackle the fixing the university? No, okay. Well, the gentleman in the front here.
You're in the business of fixing the university.
That's why they're
right
keeping
now.
quiet.
What about that?
Well, I think one reason why it is difficult to address questions of that sort is that ultimately the people who have ownership of institutions of higher education really do not care about the humanities. They don't care because they don't see it as productive, and they don't see it as productive because students and parents tell them that they aren't. Students and parents are concerned overwhelmingly with one thing, and that is, what is my diploma going to do to help me get that entry-level job at Goldman Sachs? And that is a sad fact of American higher education today. Now, an education in history is not going to do a whole lot to help you do that. And as a result, people simply don't care what history departments do. And if history departments would like to make themselves irrelevant, there are not too many people who are sitting up nights worrying about that. In fact, if you look at where budgetary contractions are taking place, and they're taking place all across the landscape of higher education, usually the first aristocrats to be put into the tumbrel and taken to the guillotine are humanities faculties. History departments either get closed down entirely or they get severely cropped. English departments, likewise, and so on. That's just because fundamentally there is an understanding on the part of the leadership of higher education that people are not going to pay for that. It's not important to them. Now, I recoil from that. And I have the same point of view that Bill McClay articulated earlier. And that is, are we training worker bees or human beings? In an authoritarian dictatorship, you don't need to worry about human beings because they're interchangeable. They're just worker bees. In a republic, in a democratic republic, you have to have citizens. And to have citizens, you have to have people who know how to govern themselves. And part of knowing how to govern oneself is knowing how others in the past have set the patterns for self-government. As soon as you put it that way, suddenly history leaps back up in importance. But how little do we articulate that? How little do we think about that? How little do we value that? Or do we, at the end of the day, in fact, go and point ourselves in the other direction that says, we really only care if our kids get that entry-level job in finance or in medicine or in law. And when we have done that, we have impoverished ourselves, and in the long run, we have jeopardized the very experiment that the American Revolution created for us. And when that happens, then we have a problem bigger than simply saying, well, how can we reform the universities? In a sense, we have to reform our own priorities as citizens and reform our priorities as the leadership of higher education. That's a big task. Maybe we should start right now.
I have a somewhat heretical question to ask, which is that as I'm listening to these fascinating reflections on the legacy of the American Revolution in American life, it struck me that the American Revolutionary War involved two major parties, and we don't hear very much from the other one, Great Britain. So I wanted to ask all of you, what do the British, how do the British remember the American Revolution? And the answer may not be of very much interest to us, right? It may be it's just a colonial dispute that what didn't go well for us, and because we won and they lost the war, so people don't like to really think too hard about wars that they lost. They went on to some grander imperial things, and they're interested in those historical questions more. But it's interesting how little, it seems, in our largely common literary culture there is from the British side about this major event in the history of both nations. And I wonder if any of you have thoughts about, first of all, what they have to say, and second of all, do we care?
George III's history painter was Benjamin West. He was salaried. He was American-born. He was from Pennsylvania, but he moved to England as a fairly young man and taken up painting and was very popular, admired by the upper crust and then by the king himself, and he became his history painter. And so the king, and we have this from the diary of an American who heard it from West. The king asked West what he thought Washington would do after the war. And West said, well, I believe he'll go home to his farm. And George III said, if he does that, he's the greatest man now living. So that was a British reaction from the top. And this is from the guy who just, lost his empire. But he saw something, recognized something. There had been partisans of the American cause throughout the war, a small minority, loud in Parliament, but voteless until the very end. So I think the British in getting over it and getting on with their own business, they incorporated ultimately the king's understanding of what had happened here and what we'd done and how we'd done it. That would be my sense of it.
So I think one of the real bright spots of the historical literature on the American Revolution in the last 30 years has been writing the British side of the war. There's a terrific new synthesis out by Andrew O'Shaughnessy, who was for many years at Monticello, and the late Trevor Bernard, called The American Revolution, an Imperial Perspective, that does some of that work. I think after the war, it became clear that the 13 rebellious colonies were simply, and this is truly heretical in the American context, not that important to the empire, right? Like, this is George III's mania about retaining the American colonies was not for the intrinsic virtue of New England, which contributed white pine, right? It was a domino theory, and the reason they lost the war was because they won the war to preserve the Caribbean, which was what was actually important. So that from the eye of empire, it's a small conflict with outlying dominions that are not as important as Ireland or the Caribbean or India. And the path of empire is pretty seamless. Like, you lose this small part of the balance sheet that was inordinately important to a mad king and a succession of ministers. The reformist thought that both feeds and is fed by the revolution in terms of broadening the franchise and stuff continues within England, and they go on to have the sun never set on half the, like, they're really okay.
There's an interesting contrast in English understanding of what happens with the revolution. For one thing, the revolution has this domino effect within the British Isles. It gives rise to successive and mounting waves of unrest, political unrest in Britain, which culminate in the Wilkes riots, in the Gordon riots, which are technically anti-Catholic riots, but nevertheless, there's a strong push there from the American example. You also see it in the fuel the American Revolution provides to Irish resistance in the 1790s, so that the volunteer movement in Ireland, that is very strongly influenced by the example of the American Revolution. And it's when the revolution ends that the British suddenly decide, okay, we don't have to placate the Irish anymore. And that's when the Irish Parliament gets dissolved and Ireland is incorporated into the United Kingdom. But the knock-on effect continues in other places. It continues in India, for instance, because Britain cannot bestow on India the military resources that it was having to divert to North America. That means the contest over control of the Indian subcontinent is going to get much more prolonged and much more difficult, and is also going to provide a whole lot less in the way of happy results for the principalities of the Indian subcontinent. It even creates Australia.
Yeah.
Because quite literally, after 1775, Britain no longer has a place to dump convict labor. We don't often think about this, but in fact, there was a steady supply for over a century of convict labor from Britain to North America. The very last convict ship made landfall in Virginia in 1775. That is how close it was to things. Well, where else then are you going to send your unwanteds? So this is when they happen upon the great solution, which is Australia. And what else is this but this exfoliation of British Empire around the world? So in place after place after place, you have these knock-on effects from the American Revolution under the aegis of the Union Jack. And it's not only the Union Jack either. The American Revolution has a marvelous tonic effect for the French Enlightenment, for the philosophes. It provides material for Condorcet. It provides material for the Encyclopédie. It goes on for that for even the movement for Belgian separatism is originally articulated on the basis of the American Revolution. So on and on for a long time afterwards, the example of what is going on in the United States plays out in European life, not just in Great Britain, but on the continent as well.
And also Latin America.
And Latin America.
Miranda, the failed Venezuelan patriot, is here during the revolution, and Henri Christophe was a drummer boy in the attack, the siege of Savannah, the future emperor of Haiti.
There are two very good general surveys of this sort of thing I might recommend to you. One of them is by Jonathan Israel, called The Expanding Blaze, which is a very detailed chronicle of the ongoing influence of the American Revolution in European affairs and in South America. The other is entitled to Make the World Over Again, borrowing the phrase from Tom Paine. And the author of Matthew, the last name won't come to me, I think it's Matthew Rosen, it's something similar to that. So I'm doing bibliography spontaneously. But those two volumes, these are relatively new books, so I think within the last 5 years. And both of them will give you a very general overview of the impact of the revolution outside the immediate confines of North America.
Well, we have 4 minutes, so if someone can ask a very brief question and we can have very brief answers, we can squeeze one more in. Who's up for it? Yes.
I want to circle back to Mr. McCabe. Earlier today, and his questions of how do we revive the spirit of '76? How do we teach civic education or reintroduce it into schools? And this is not at the university level. This is at the middle school level is where I'm thinking. You know, who is writing the books now? And there was a lot of discussion about what books over the last 200 years have been taught in school, but how do we reintroduce that so that we can have the morale and moral education of civic responsibility reintroduced into schools?
The heirs of the McGuffey Reader. Any suggestions?
The Gilder Lehrman Institute is doing the Lord's work.
Yeah,
The Gilder Lehrman Institute is doing the Lord's work. They've got 36,000 schools they are associated with, giving materials to.
I think the trajectory on civic education is actually very positive, and it's not a reaction to the 2016 election. It's longer than that. We evacuated civics from the schools. We did it deliberately, right, in the late 1960s with the assumption that education and what binds us together smacks of religion and is best done at home, right? There was a skepticism of civic religion as a breach between the wall between church and state. I think some of the dysfunction that you see in our politics today is raising 2-3 generations of low information, low propensity voters who lack that content. Since about 2012, there's been a groundswell in red states, blue states, purple states, and municipalities to bring civics in a rigorous way, in precisely the way that Bill McClay talked about, right? Not just a user's manual for the 3 branches of government, but really rearing citizens. I would add to Gilder Lehrman, iCivics, which does gamified content,
And we both worked on
we
it.
both worked very closely on a framework called Educating for American Democracy. iCivics materials are in all 50 states, and given the different learning standards and political regimes in our federalist system, that's an incredible achievement. I think the answer probably won't be in the McGuffey Reader in the sense of it's not going to be the next great textbooks. It's going to be what Gilder Lehrman is doing, what Colonial Williamsburg is pulling together with a group of historic sites in a site called history.org. It's modules. It's a different kind of instrument, but I am strategically optimistic about the trend line around civics.
Putting materials out there, primary materials that kids can access online.
All right, well, strategically optimistic is probably a good way to end our program today. And before we do end, remember that there are volumes that have already been published that are available here, and there are many more to come, so keep an eye out for those. And please do thank our panelists today for their talk.